history of the world, told in 6 oil paintings.
Although it looks so obviously over its shoulder at the art of the past, Barry's painting does represent a first faltering step towards modern painting. Barry's contribution to British art was a whole new idea of what the artist could be, someone determined to pursue their own personal vision, no matter where it might lead them.
His great scheme starts in the mists of time and moves on, conveniently skipping 2,000 years of history, straight into the late 18th century, where we see the great and the good of Georgian society. Its climax is a panorama of heaven and hell, where heaven, as is often the case in paintings of the Last Judgment, looks like rather a dull place. But the seething pit of hell below has been painted with altogether more gusto and panache. The corrupt politician, the slanderer, the dishonest picture dealer. Barry hugely enjoyed casting these people into eternal damnation, and he did it with a pictorial vigour almost worthy of the great Baroque master Peter Paul Rubens. But that's a big almost. Sadly, the truth about Barry's attempted masterpiece is that it didn't quite work. It's a rather sickly mixture of allegory, portraiture, and pastiche. It's full of unconvincing figures. A water nymph like an inflatable woman. A Greek philosopher with an unusually enlarged brain. Barry's included his own self-portrait, and he's given himself a martyred, long-suffering expression. For good reason. His Herculean effort received little more than a lukewarm response. Barry became severely paranoid and withdrew from the world. In all but talent, he was the very model of the mad modern artist, a visionary who suffered in pain and neglect for the glory of his art, a man condemned to live out his life on the fringes of society.
In France and America there was political revolution, but in Britain there was revolution at the level of culture and art, a revolution which might not have changed society as visibly as the events in Paris of 1789, but which did so just as profoundly because it changed the way in which people saw, thought, and felt.
James Barry was just one of a large number of British writers and intellectuals who took revolution as the model for their own activities. Thomas Paine published The Rights of Man. William Godwin published Political Justice. And Godwin's wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, published the mother text of modern feminism, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. The artist William Blake, poet, publisher and printmaker, was a man at the very centre of this group of London radicals and dissenters. Blake had hero-worshipped Barry, and like him, he was an insurrectionist at heart. But unlike him, Blake was a brilliantly original thinker and artist.
Blake never worked on anything like the same scale as Barry, and most of his pictures take the form of illustrations to the books of poetry, which he wrote, engraved, and coloured entirely by hand. He published them in tiny editions, and copies are extremely rare, but they're really the best way to get inside Blake's imagination.
He spent his life dreaming up a world, shaping his thoughts and energies into mysterious but vibrant images. He was passionately unorthodox and didn't really think of himself as an artist, but an unruly modern druid. Most forms of established order were anathema to him, but above all, established religion. He saw the Pope as a fat vampire feeding on human weakness. Blake's art was a cry for freedom from all forms of political or mental servitude. This wonderful illustration to Dante's Divine Comedy is supposed to be an image of lost souls trapped in purgatory. But I think of it as Blake's way of depicting his own exuberant delight in unconstrained, eternal energy. This figure, called Glad Day, was described by Blake as the spirit of 1789. It's full of the gentle, idealistic optimism with which the English radicals first greeted the news from France. It's the equivalent to Wordsworth's lines about the start of the revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven.
It's in Blake's books that this love of liberty is most clearly expressed. It's there at the level of their very form. As he engraved his own words, Blake turned them into shapes like wispy foliage or tendrils. It's as if text itself has somehow been freed from the tyranny of a typeface and begun to metamorphose into something wilder and more organic.
The British had been happier with words than images, but Blake stood that on its head. His spidery handwriting was really just another form of painting. Like many revolutionaries, Blake also yearned for law and order. In his case, that need expressed itself in a lifelong quest for God.
When he was a young man, Blake was hired to make precise drawings of the tombs here in Westminster Abbey. They clearly had a profound effect on him. His own art would be full of curious, gothically stiff figures, figures drawn to resemble stone effigies.
This peaceful imagery represents the other side of Blake, not an art pulling restlessly towards some revolutionary future, but one harking back to the religious certainties of what Blake saw as a purer and more devout age. In exploring this fantasy of returning to the Middle Ages, Blake anticipated a whole generation of Victorian artists and architects. And I think the paradox of Blake's life was that this self-confessed rebel should have had such a deep-seated need for some form of external spiritual authority. Occasionally, as in this delicate watercolour of a pair of angels, their wings touching to form a Gothic arch, Blake does genuinely seem to have found the faith and tranquillity he was looking for. But more often, there's an anxious tinge to his work. Blake claimed that he actually saw many of the supernatural creatures he depicted in his art. This, he said, was the man who came to see him in his dreams and taught him how to paint. This peculiar creature was the ghost of a flea, which he drew one day to prove to some doubting Thomas that he really did see visions. I think Blake was a bit of a fraud, but I also think this rather cheap, fairground spiritualist act that he went in for is rather revealing. I think he was trying to fool himself as well as everyone else. Deep down, he was terrified that there were no guardian angels, and that he was living in a world that had been abandoned by God. In the 1760s and 70s, Joseph Wright of Derby had painted a series of pictures of scientific experiments. This painting, an experiment on a bird in an air pump, hangs in the National Gallery. When Wright painted it, it was still just possible to see science as the handmaiden of religious belief. The scene is charged with a sense of hushed expectancy and lit by an intense, otherworldly light, an effect borrowed from Baroque altarpieces. Wright certainly meant his picture to prompt reflections on God's benevolence, his gift of oxygen, and with it life. The lecturer who's about to release the stopcock on the air pump has been made to resemble God the Father. The bird about to be saved has been made to resemble the dove of the Holy Spirit. When I look at this picture, I see the age of faith turning into the age of reason, and I see the ideas of a new age sucking the air out of religious belief. Once that's happened, what's left? Wright shows us in this self-portrait only the questioning, doubting, troubled individual. The self was one of the great subjects of the period. More self-portraits were painted at this time than ever before. This was a generation obsessed by its reflection in the mirror. This self-portrait by Samuel Palmer is one of the most brilliant of all 19th century pictures. To be an artist is to be the most special type of person, this picture says. Palmer's fixed, almost hypnotic stare also shows us that a whole new order of consciousness came into being during this time. A new, rather lonely, and definitely egocentric sense of self-awareness.
The age of introspection also produced an architecture of introspection, and this is its masterpiece, Sir John Soane's Museum.
On the outside, Soane's home here in Lincoln's Inn Fields seems fairly conventional. But on the inside, there's some of the most extraordinary and inventive use of space to be found anywhere in European domestic architecture. Soane was a great collector and hoarder, and this is his art gallery. With its walls that fold out like pages, it's a cross between a room and a scrapbook. I've always wondered why it never caught on with more people. It's such an obviously brilliant solution to the problem of owning too many pictures and not having enough walls. As chief architect to the Bank of England, Soane was a pillar of the establishment, a man at the heart of British trade and empire. But inside his own deeply unconventional home, he created a cave, a grotto dedicated to the self, its loves, and its preoccupations. It's the strangest and the most haunting building I know.
This is architecture as self-portraiture, a house that feels like the model of a mind.
Visiting the house is literally like taking a tour through the various compartments of someone's brain, or walking through their moods. Upstairs, there's a sense of clarity and enlightenment. This is a place literally dedicated to light. Its colour, which Soane is said to have borrowed from the palette of his friend, the painter Turner, is the colour of the sun. Soane was fascinated by the play of light, and his house is full of these convex mirrors, which he used to catch and reflect it. But as you descend into the basement, the mood turns. Noticing, here in a quiet corner in Sussex. Turner was invited to stay here at Petworth House by George O'Brien Wyndham, the flamboyant 3rd Earl of Egremont. The Earl possessed an extremely large income, most of which he spent on wine, women, and art. At Petworth, he surrounded himself with paintings and sculptures. Unlike most of his peers, he had a lot of time for living British painters, especially Turner. He was probably the only person Turner knew who loved works of art almost as much as he did. And the son of a barber and the aristocrat struck up an unusually close friendship. Turner was given the old library with its clear north light to use as his studio. It's easier for some artists to do great things when they feel loved, and Turner was loved here. He found the space to play, to experiment, to try out new things. These watercolours are his diary of the daily life of the house, chatting by the fire, playing billiards. But they're much more than just that. Substance has come to interest Turner far less than colour. An unmade bed becomes an apparition of scarlet. An expanse of wall becomes a gorgeous patch of yellow. At Petworth, Turner's evolution as a painter suddenly and marvellously accelerated. But the event which finally liberated him into the glorious freedoms of his late style took place in London.
On the evening of the 16th of October 1834, the Houses of Parliament suddenly burst into flames. A huge crowd rushed to the riverside to watch the largest bonfire of the century, and Turner was among them. As soon as he got there, he rented a boat, and he went out into the middle of the river, and he produced these fantastically immediate sketches of the event. You can still almost feel the heat coming off them.
I've looked at these watercolours many times, but each new time I'm still surprised by them. I think they're among the most exciting paintings in the world. No artist before Turner had ever captured the essence of fire as vividly as this, and they've never been surpassed. Once British art had been all but destroyed by the fires of the Reformation, but here, in a wonderful reversal of that, fire's been turned into some of the greatest British painting of all time.
I think what Turner saw when he looked into those flames was the image of himself, his destiny as an artist. The fire that consumed the Houses of Parliament was Turner, because he was the fire that would devour the established order of art.
There's no structure in fire, no order. Fire fascinated Turner because it was such a potent emblem of his conviction that change was the ruling principle of the world. He was constantly searching for the essence of things, the irreducible matter of the universe. Fire would become colour, and colour would become light. Of course, Turner wasn't the first artist to be fascinated by light. The subtle play of reflections in Vermeer's pictures gives them their quality of bewitched realism. Caravaggio spent his life exploring the drama of light and its potency as a symbol of religious revelation. But despite their differences, the great artists of the past, indeed all artists before Turner, shared one assumption. Light's function in their paintings was to model form. But in Turner, it's the other way round. In Turner, form exists to give reality to light. It's light that's real, form that's the inessential, the transitory, the insubstantial. This insight is what all Turner's earlier narrative pictures of destruction and apocalypse had been leading up to. Empires will fall, buildings will crumble, but light will always endure.
Turner's brilliance was only really understood by the French Impressionists. Monet was overwhelmed by Turner's paintings when he visited London in the early 1870s. And about 10 years later, Monet, Degas, Renoir, Pissarro, Boudin, and other leading Impressionists signed a joint statement acknowledging their debt.
We have applied ourselves with passion, they wrote, to the rendering of forms in movement and the fugitive phenomena of light. But we cannot forget that we have been preceded in this great path by the illustrious Monsieur Turner. But Monsieur Turner never got that message. He'd been dead for more than 30 years when they wrote their letter. Turner's response to the barrage was to become a very private, even secretive person, and his biggest secret lay in the seaside town of Margate. When Turner was a child, he lived here for a while, and later in life he returned to paint. He'd board with a couple called the Booths in a house on the seafront.
In 1835, Mr. Booth died, and shortly afterwards Turner moved in with his young widow, Sophia. He persuaded her to come to London with him, and he bought her a house here in Chelsea. They were together for 17 years. But throughout that time, Turner kept their relationship completely secret. He even assumed a false identity while he was living with Sophia. He called himself Admiral Puggy Booth. For the rest of his life, he spent half his time as Mr. Turner, the noted Royal Academician, and the other half masquerading as a retired admiral of the fleet.
By hiding away from the oppressive gaze of his critics, by becoming Admiral Booth, Turner got back the space and freedom to experiment which he'd first found at Petworth. As Booth, no one could judge him. He could paint what and how he wanted. And that's what he did in his very last and most incandescently brilliant works. This is the essence of Turner, his vision, purged finally and forever of story, anxiety, and academy. He had Barry's determination to pursue a personal vision, no matter how much mockery or pain he might have to endure. He possessed Blake's revolutionary energy, his spirit of rebellion, and his determination to overthrow conventional ways of seeing and believing. Like John Constable, he was a tremendous innovator with the physical matter of paint itself. And from his friend John Soane, he got the idea that a man's work might be his own memorial, a monument to his life. Unlike Soane, Turner didn't build a museum to himself, but he trusted the British to do it for him. It took us more than a century to get round to building this annex to the Tate Gallery, but we did it in the end. On his death, Turner left the nation 19,331 of his works, saying, "Keep them together, for what use are they but together?" If I had to choose my own favourite, I think it'd be this miraculous late watercolour of a hotel bedroom in Venice. It's an endlessly fascinating picture, and within these few square inches of paper stained by coloured water, we can see, almost as if mapped out for later generations, the entire course of what we call modern art. There's the spatial freedom of Cubism, the colour and sensuality of Matisse, the imperious free geometry of Mondrian, the vastness and the sublimity of the finest abstract American painting of the 20th century. I still can't quite believe that Turner painted it in 1840. He wasn't just ahead of his time. He was light years ahead of his time. Just 2 years before Turner's death in 1851, a Frenchman, Armand Fizeau, arrived at the first accurate terrestrial measurement of the speed of light. I wonder if it's pure coincidence that Turner was painting in his late style, just when 19th century physics was on the verge of its own quantum leap. Turner sensed, by some subtle prescience, that it was above all in examining and pondering the phenomenon of light that mankind would come to ask the biggest questions. In the end, I think Turner realized that there were no answers to those questions. He saw the universe as a succession of inexplicable events, taking place in an indefinite void of uncertain origin. But his response was wonderfully simple. He set himself free. He became his own God. And Turner said, "Let there be light." And there was light.